And again, my name is Brian McIntosh, and I am a happy member of all three of the sponsoring organizations tonight for this town hall: the Etobicoke Climate Action, the Eculinks Etobicoke, and the Central Etobicoke Community Hub Initiative. And it's our privilege and pleasure to do this town hall this evening as we make available to you the candidates and the responses that they're about to share about the important issues that face us as a city and as a ward here in Etobicoke Centre. I want to begin tonight, as many are beginning many events now since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, with a land acknowledgement. And we acknowledge as we begin tonight the history, spirituality, culture, and stewardship of the land of the Indigenous peoples of this region, including the Huron-Wendat, Petun, and Seneca nations, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit, who are Anishinaabe people. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Ojibwa and allied nations, and we seek to live in respect, peace, and right relations with them as we live, work, and play upon their traditional territory. I want to just introduce our candidates this evening. We have 3 of the 5. First of all, Miriam Hashimi is here with us, and Stephen Holliday, the incumbent in Etobicoke Centre, is with us, and Thomas Iannucciello is also with us this evening, and we're glad to have these 3. Catherine Habus, or Habus, I'm not sure how to pronounce her last name, regrets that she was unable to be contacted. We regret that we were unable to contact her. But also Sam Ralphie regrets that he will be unable to attend this evening. But we do have 3 of the 5 who are on the docket, and we're going to proceed. And my job as moderator is simply, as you would guess, to keep the conversation civil, to keep the questions in proper order, and to encourage the candidates to close when it's time to close, and so on and so on. We are not making the chat available or the participants' faces obviously available tonight on the screen, but we will be encouraging you to contribute to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen on this Zoom webinar, where you can offer a question of importance to you or others you know, and you can also vote on questions that you see in the Q&A to rise them in importance. And by the end of the evening, we're hoping to take 2 or 3 of your questions from the audience. We have prepared 6 questions in advance, and these candidates have received 2 questions on the green economy or the environment, climate change, 2 questions on social issues, poverty and housing, and 2 questions on the economy. And so those prepared questions will be asked first. And each candidate will have 3 minutes for an opening remark, and then 2 minutes to answer each of our prepared questions, as well as 2 minutes to respond to our audience questions. And I just wanted to introduce our tech team. Alex Cameron is the one who's running the webinar and is going to respond to any concerns or problems that we have. And you see on the screen Cora Dusk, who is our timekeeper this evening, and she will be holding up a green sheet in her screen as the candidates begin their answer. And then when they get to the 30 seconds left mark, she will hold up a yellow card and then hold up a red card when the time has run out for that candidate's response. So just note that and try to keep your remarks in a timely fashion. That would be great. I've done an order, as I said, that will just be in alphabetical order according to last name. And so I'm going to ask immediately for Miriam to offer a 3-minute opening remark. Miriam.
Thank you. My name is Miriam, and I'm a professional artist, a social justice advocate, and as an Afghan Canadian woman, I'm the unconventional candidate here. I have a background in working with nonprofits on issues like anti-genocide, anti-racism and oppression, and I've served as a peer mentor for young newcomers to Canada, helping high school age students with things like their homework, improving their English, applying to college and university, and planning and creating events that help them feel more involved in their home. I had my first introduction to politics with Elections Canada when I served as the Deputy Returning Officer. And when I had first applied for the job, I applied as a poll clerk. And, when I showed up to the interview, the older woman assessing me asked me what I was studying in school. I told her at the time that I was taking political science at the University of Toronto. And right away, she told me, well, what are you doing applying for the poll clerk's position? We should get you involved in some real politics. So right away, she offered me the Deputy Returning Officer's position. And I really couldn't believe it, because it was the first time in my life that someone really believed in me. And I don't think I'll ever forget the fact that what she did for me, even though I don't remember her name, it gave me the courage to ask for more in life. And that's important because when I look for faces like mine in Canadian politics, they come far and few between. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a chairman, I don't come from a background of power or privilege. No one in my family has previously held office, and English wasn't even my first language. Because of that, some would say, who are you to run against other men? Who are you to try and win? But I think they're wrong. I think all of those things are exactly what make me a good fit for City Council, because there's nothing in life I take for granted. And I think we need to ask ourselves what the traditional candidates who look so good on paper do for us now. From recycling to the conditions of the roads, cleaning animal remains off our streets, our city councillor is the person who affects our day-to-day lives more than any other level of government. But most people who have these jobs now are just trying to keep their job and win the next election. And that's not really the type of thinking that's going to fix the housing affordability crisis or climate change or any other pressing issues. It doesn't make sense to expect new solutions under the same circumstances. If they could do it, they should have done it by now. And the reality is we need to change things up. We need to open the dialogue to include as many different points of view as possible so that we stand the best chance at actually improving the lives of people in the city. That's why I think I would make a meaningful contribution. I think I have a lot of ideas and a lot of different viewpoints and the lived experience to be able to help this city get to where it wants to be. Thank you.
Very timely, Miriam. Thank you. And Stephen, you are next with a 3-minute opening remark.
Thank you, Brian, and good evening, everybody. I'm Stephen Holliday. I'm seeking re-election as councillor for Ward 2. Just a little bit about me. I'm a 46-year-old man. I'm a married father of 3 kids who go to school in the Etobicoke Centre. I have retirement age parents that live in Etobicoke, and I've been really proud to call this place my home for my life. My background in education, I attended Ryerson University, now Metropolitan University. I actually studied architecture and I majored in design, and I did a lot of work in building science and project management as part of that degree. And from that, I joined the Ontario Public Service. And so I can tell you that public service is in my blood. I spent 15 years in the Ontario Public Service in various roles. I did things ranging from technology to facilities management, capitalizing on my architecture background. I did emergency planning and emergency management, and encountered some really exciting things at the Ministry of Energy that I think has set me up well for some of the work that I've done as a member of council. And so I have been elected for 2 terms. I've been very proud of my record in those 2 terms. In that time, I was appointed as a deputy mayor and did that for a number of years. I also chaired a couple of committees, including the city's audit committee, which is, people laugh and they say, well, audit's about numbers. In fact, it's not. It's about the inner workings of the city, and it's about change. And there's a lot of exciting things that I can point to that I've done there. Just personal attributes. I take my work exceptionally seriously. I go to every single council meeting, which seems the obvious, but if you compare my record to others, you'll see that I come to the meetings prepared. I come ready for debate. I speak my mind, and I worked very hard to make this city a better place because I care about it. I just want to say thank you to the organizers tonight. There's some very, very meaty topics that we're going to talk about. We could spend an hour and a half on each of them, no problem. But you'll have a little sampling of a couple of minutes from each of us to talk about them and what resonates to the surface as we mention the topics. And I would encourage you to have a look at my website or send me a question, either email or give me a call if you wanted to explore any of the topics further. So thank you very much, and congratulations to the other candidates who have put their name forward to be part of the democratic process.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And lastly, Thomas, a 3-minute opening remark.
Hello, fellow residents of Etobicoke. My name is Thomas Iannaciello. I'm a working class millennial, a renter, and a public transit user. I work with autonomous vehicles, holding them to the highest possible safety standards and making sure they're safe enough to operate in our community. I'm helping to bring future technology to our city, reduce the emissions generated by our logistics sector, and working towards our goal of Vision Zero. I chose to run in this election because our current mayor and city council are not representing the interests of myself or my generation. Etobicoke Centre's incumbent councillor, Holiday, who you just heard, has the worst record on council. He's voted no by far the most times of any councillor and has had the most motions voted down by other members of council. He does not cooperate with his fellow councillors and accomplishes nothing for you. He does not represent you and will not help the city meet its objectives. We're facing several crises simultaneously: the climate, housing, mental health, and safety. The city has made big public statements and endorsements like the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, Vision Zero, and the 880 Cities Zero Food Waste Strategy, but the city isn't providing sufficient funding or taking enough meaningful actions to address these very urgent problems. The sad part is that the solutions to most of our problems already exist. They've been tested and proven to be effective in other cities around the world. Helsinki has solved homelessness. Palo Alto has the best recycling program. Paris stopped wasting food. Seoul has perfected public transit, and Pittsburgh has maintained their affordable housing. So my objective as your councillor will be to adapt global best practices to fix the problems we're facing here at home. Also, the solutions to all of our problems are very interconnected. Through better planning and zoning, we can build multi-use 15-minute communities where everyone can live, work, study, and play without needing to own a car. Communities that are affordable by all income ranges, accessible to all ages and mobilities, equitable to all ethnicities and diversities, sustainable and resilient to face the future of a warming planet. No other candidate in Etobicoke Centre has been working as hard as I have during this campaign. I have a website, a platform, full contact information, and social media publicly available. I've been canvassing, doing interviews, answering your emails, completing questionnaires, signing pledges, and receiving endorsements. No other candidate in Ward 2 can say they've done the same. Toronto is the most multicultural city in the world. We need to embrace our diversity, learn from the successes of our peers around the globe, weave their policy threads into the tapestry of our city, and build the world-class Toronto we all know it can be. So vote for me, Thomas Iannaciello, as your representative on council. I'll vote yes for progress.
Thank you, Thomas. And with that, we now have the 6 prepared questions. And I'm going to read the question once, and Stephen, you will have the first response to this first question. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, humanity has only a short window of opportunity to mitigate the worst effects of our human-created climate crisis. The culprit is the greenhouse gas emissions we produce every day in Toronto. 57% from homes and buildings, 36% from transportation, 7% from waste. Toronto responded to the climate crisis by declaring a climate emergency in October of 2019 and developing Transform TO and the Toronto Green Standard. This vision, if implemented quickly, will vastly reduce emissions while supporting the economy. However, most builders are choosing the lowest available tier of the Toronto Green Standard, which means that these new towers, homes, and commercial buildings will have to undergo costly retrofits to meet Transform TO's climate goals. So if elected, what are the measures and the timeframes you would support to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to zero or near zero, including but not limited to adoption of district energy, updates to the building code, green transportation, increased EV charging options, green industry propagation, and an electrical grid with no greenhouse gas emissions? That's a long question, but I'm not going to read it 3 times. Stephen, over to you for the first response.
Indeed, thank you, Brian. And actually, you hit on many of the notes within the Transform TO climate change plan. It's a massive undertaking that we can't cover in 2 minutes. But I will say you're right. The Toronto Green Standard is the minimum that we ask builders to do, and you've seen council ratcheting that up over time. That has to do with a couple of things: the availability of technology, and of course the cost. Because we can't say, well, we want affordable housing and housing that's within reach on one side, and then push the price out of reach for the cost of constructing it to try to implement the technology. There's a balance point to make it work and keep people's faith in it. The city has sent around a little circular that really is the takeaway for a lot of people about what you need to do. And the big components of the climate change action plan have to do with improving our buildings. And the city has a lot of work to do with that, to facilitate it, to cut the red tape, to make it possible to have things like district energy systems that cross public right-of-ways. Some of the things that I've been involved in that's already started is the work that I've done at Toronto Hydro to strengthen the grid, to bring all of the electricity that's going to be needed to electrify the system. That's a complex undertaking, and it's very, very expensive. The one thing that we don't talk a lot about is about waste and what happens inside multi-residential buildings that formulates part of that 7% of emissions. I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity, especially when it comes to organic wastes. And organic waste is something that we do very well in the city of Toronto to process and actually remove renewable natural gas from it. So I think that's a growth area I'm really excited about in the future, and watching our society transform and improve and take part in this plan in so many different ways.
Thank you, Stephen. And over to you then, Thomas, for this question on greenhouse gas emissions.
I've been asking candidates in elections this question as on the other side of this town hall situation for years, and I'm so happy to be answering it as a candidate. So I took a tour of the headquarters of the Ontario Association of Architects, and it's an amazing building. It's fully electrified, grid-tied, solar roof, and their heating bill in the winter is almost nothing. I highly recommend taking a look at that. We have the technology and resources to build carbon neutral, but developers don't do it because it doesn't make them as much money. So what we need to do as a city is make building the buildings that we want built make more money for the developer than underperforming buildings they want to build. There's a few ways we can accomplish that. First, if developers meet higher standards, they should have fewer committee meetings and hearings and more leniency to design and build the project the way they want. As long as they're meeting the city's and residents' needs in the original proposal in terms of number of units, percentage of affordability, and carbon neutrality, there shouldn't need to be 18 months of meetings to discuss the details. Second is adjusting the formula for development charges to scale in favor of building what the city wants, raising the cost of constructing inefficient buildings and lowering the cost of building sustainably. Etobicoke has a district energy project under development at 6 points in Ward 3, but it will provide geothermal heating to buildings on the south end of our ward along Bloor. I'm really excited about this project and the community developments that are being proposed that will be using it. It's called N-Wave. Please look that up too. Yes, we need to update the building code, require new developments to have EV chargers, and we need to cooperate with the province on apprenticeship programs for green builders. We need to only buy electric buses and other transit. Toronto has endorsed the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, but it isn't really living up to it. We need to put our foot down and stand by that commitment, not build any more fossil fuel infrastructure. We need to send a message loud and clear to Doug Ford that electricity from his gas plants will not be welcome here. Sorry.
Thank you, Thomas. And so far, we're doing very well for time. So thank you. Miriam, you're the last respondent on the greenhouse gas emissions question.
Well, first, I think we should break it down. I think like homes and buildings account for 57% of greenhouse gas emissions. while transportation amounts for 36%, and the remaining 7% comes from waste. Considering that energy use in buildings make up more than half of the city's greenhouse gas output, I think tackling emissions from that source should be our top priority. As it is, as the other councillors have the other candidates have noted, the city has developed the Transform TO initiative and the Toronto Green Standard to reduce emissions to an ambitious net zero by 2040. The idea behind net zero is taking a project or building and offsetting its climate impacts by designing or inputting something that counterbalances its emissions. The Green Standard is a sustainable design requirement that sets the bar for city-owned buildings and requires developers of city projects to meet a minimum threshold. But the problem is that this standard might be a requirement of city-owned buildings, but that says nothing of privately owned developments, which we see going up at a much faster rate than other projects. For private developers, the Green Standard might offer financial incentives for reducing those emissions, but not enough take part, because when you consider not just the operational emissions of a building, that's what it produces when it's operating, but also the emissions produced from the actual construction of that building, the financial incentive might not actually be there. At the end of the day, the Green Standard is a step in the right direction, but without more universal enforcement, all it really is a shiny is a suggestion that's being packaged up in a shiny wrapping and misleading people into thinking that developers are being regulated when they're not. I think if we're going to think about a sustainable future, we need to think about how we're going to regulate that and not just make suggestions and leave it up to for-profit organizations to choose to do the right thing, because they rarely ever do.
Thank you, Miriam. I appreciate that. And listen, I just want to invite our audience again and urge them to include in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen any questions that may come to you that you want to address to the candidates tonight. We're hoping to get 2 or 3 questions from the audience toward the end of this gathering. And we look forward to hearing your voice in the Q&A function to offer, and also upvote whatever questions you see in there that you think are really important, and they'll rise to the top. Our second question on climate change is on biodiversity and the circular economy, and Thomas, you'll be answering first. Biodiversity loss on an unprecedented scale is being driven by loss of habitat and exacerbated by urban sprawl, climate change, and pollution. Toronto's rivers and Lake Ontario have become receptacles for massive amounts of toxic plastic waste, oftentimes from single-use plastic items. What steps, if any, would you support to further eliminate the use of single-use plastics, unnecessary excess packaging, and improve Toronto's waste management system? And how can Toronto support native species biodiversity within the city and in our rivers and Lake Ontario? Thomas, you have 2 minutes.
We've all seen the litter in our communities and garbage overflowing from public bins that haven't been emptied. You may have even seen the bins getting emptied only for the garbage and recycling to be mixed together in the same truck. Toronto is only diverting 52% of our waste from landfills. We can and must do better to deal with plastic waste. So let's take a look at Palo Alto, California, where they divert 82% of their waste from landfills. The Disposable Foodware Ordinance came into effect on the first day of 2020 as part of their zero waste strategy. Plastic straws, utensils, stir sticks, drink plugs, produce bags, bundled utensils and condiments, and other disposable plastic items are no longer allowed in Palo Alto. All food service establishments in Palo Alto are required to only use reusable or compostable foodware. All compostable items must be acceptable in the city's compost collection program. They also made the 3-bin system required. Every resident and business is provided with garbage recycling and compost bins, and they face a fine if they don't use them. Toronto already has multiple companies and programs providing compostable, reusable, and returnable takeout containers. So there's no reason why we can't set a deadline to make these containers required across the city. We also already have the same 3-bin system here. It's just a matter of making it required to force the large residential buildings and businesses to start using it properly. The money saved by the city not having to deal with as much plastic and revenue earned from fines for non-compliance can pay for upgrading our recycling facilities to ensure everything can be recycled will be. Our green spaces and ravines currently aren't being properly funded or cared for. The city raises money for them through charity and relies on volunteers to do a lot of the maintenance work. We need to work with the Toronto Region Conservation Authority and the local Indigenous peoples to establish a proper stewardship program which will foster native biodiversity and remove invasive species. This will provide habitat for our endangered species like the monarch butterflies, will help make our city more resilient to a warming climate, and save money by preventing floods and extreme heat events.
Thank you, Thomas. You must have had your answer timed perfectly there. Thank you. And number one, Miriam, you are next on biodiversity and the circular economy.
Thank you. And I believe the question was also on single-use plastics in the city, and I think that's something that we really need to address. While progress is being made, grocery stores are a good example of that. I think we need to go beyond scratching the surface. On the one hand, we have banned or at least really reduced single-use plastic bags, which is good for us. But on the other hand, that's not really true, because when we go to the grocery store, we see those little plastic bags that are in the produce aisles, and people often use 2 or 3 or even more of them when they go shopping. And so those things, they almost immediately go in the garbage. At least even those plastic bags that we use to bring our groceries home, they sometimes get used as a garbage bag or something like that. These other ones, they have absolutely no use beyond bringing it home. I think that I think we also need to take a look at how much plastic is being wasted on the operational end of big box grocery stores before products even hit our shelves. I think an alternative would be increasing the frequency of farmers markets, because farmer markets not only have a lower embodied carbon footprint in the way that they get food to the consumer, but they also encourage people to bring bags from home because their approach is entirely different. Consumers have entirely different expectations. I also think, for example, another source of the city's single-use plastic that a lot of people might not think about is those little yellow parking tickets. They've turned them plastic just so you know you got the ticket. It doesn't get ruined in the rain, and it's made to last. And what do we usually do with those tickets when we get them? We get rid of them. That's something that I think a lot of people don't think about. That's single-use plastic that really takes a toll on the environment. I think when it comes to biodiversity, developers really need to be held to a higher standard, because there are actual instances where local species were going to be disrupted in their local habitats had local residents not stepped in. I think we need targeted plans and experts leaders in the city whose main mandate is to look out for these protected species. Sorry for going over.
No, it's just a couple of seconds. Thank you. And Stephen, you have the last word on this question.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And you know what? To the credit of my my other fellow candidates, I mean, they touched on some really important notes. I'm not sure I agree with all the details, though. Extended producer responsibility means that the province is calling the shots now on the recycling system, but the emphasis is also on them to deal with things on a regional basis. The big box stores that the other candidate talked about, they're in Mississauga. I mean, that's where we're going to shop. So if we take a ban in Toronto and they don't do it over there, I mean, it's not really going to change much. But nonetheless, I take their point on the notes, and I think it's important to think about these things and at least to begin to at least shape consumer behaviors and look at packaging and things that enter our country from imports and what we produce. But I will mention 2 other things in terms of biodiversity. I mean, I'm proud about some of the changes that we're planning for Etobicoke Centennial Park to introduce renaturalized areas, and the work that we've done in our ravine system. You can look up the article in the Etobicoke Guardian, but I took a bashing because we planted some trees there. The people didn't want them, but this is all part of our stormwater management system, and these ravines are very, very important habitats for wildlife in the city. The last thing I would mention is the vector of plastics and how they get into our water system, and that often has to do with our stormwater management system. That's something we have an incredible emphasis on in Etobicoke Centre because of the age of the system and the flooding. And so we invest in that to try to make sure that it functions well, that we get rid of those combined sewer outfalls, and we try to put in green infrastructure to absorb the wastewater instead of piping it directly into the rivers and then right into Lake Ontario, carrying all that plastic with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. We're moving on now to our social issue questions. And the first one is on poverty and income inequality. And I'm going to ask Miriam again to respond first to this question. Poverty and income inequality is a continuing problem in Toronto and is more acute than many either know about or care to admit in Etobicoke. While many social conditions conspire to create poverty, our city services often fail to meet the needs of the most vulnerable and impoverished among us, including seniors, youth, single mothers, immigrants, etc., leaving people having to access food banks out of the cold programs or other community or city-run crisis services. At its heart, there are also hidden or explicit biases that leave racial minorities, particularly Black and Indigenous peoples, in precarious or even dire economic circumstances. So if elected, what specific actions might you initiate, support, or advocate for, both in terms of city policy and in community-based options to create a more economically and racially just Etobicoke and Toronto? And in our writing in particular, will this support include the creation of a community hub, which some of us have been working on for a long time? Miriam, you are first.
Thank you. Well, I think when we talk about these groups who do face a lot of poverty and income inequality, I'm part of that group. Growing up, my parents came to this country with nothing. And growing up, I remember some of the best. I think the city's completely changed from what it used to be. When I was younger, there was something called the Toronto Star program. And if you signed your kids up for it around Christmas time, they would give you this little box and there would be, gloves and a book and a little toy and just something to make you feel included with the holidays. That was something that really meant a lot to me. There were coat drives. There were a lot more public services for people than there are today. I think the city needs to be better about partnering with, local organizations and with groups that can provide these type of social connections, because when people get left out in the cold, it really is a shame for the city. I also think that we need to create more arts-based programs, because these are the type of programs that really bring people together. I think that we need to allow more people access to city jobs. I think there's this general feel that city jobs, you have to know someone to be able to get one. And I think we should open up those doors. I think everyone should have an equal chance at getting these jobs. I think a lot of our problems can be solved by looking at another problem. I think it's all a domino effect. And when you include everyone and when you think outside the box, you come up with more resourceful solutions. And I think that when you bring in those types of people, you not only make it more equitable, but you also enrich the conversations and the solutions that we make up for the city.
Thank you, Miriam. And Stephen, you are next on this question of poverty and income inequality.
Thanks, Brian. It's funny the timing of these things. I'm still doing a counselor's work during an election. I actually took a call earlier today from someone that's on the edge, that needs to get into the system to be looked after. So if you don't think we have homeless people in this community, you don't know what you're talking about. They are our friends and our family. They are people that have had a marriage breakdown. They've run into addiction or a mental health issue. It's out there. And I've had that conversation over and over about, you realize you're homeless and here's some steps that you can take to try to get things addressed. One of the biggest things most important things that I worked on in the audit committee of all places was about a case management system. We've got all the pieces in there. We've got passionate public servants who care about people. We've got shelters, we've got infrastructure, we've got program services, there's money. How do you combine that all together and get somebody into the system and bring them through it and set them up for success? And there's examples where we've fallen down and where people have fallen through the cracks. So I think it's a mashup of technology, but there is a plan out there, and I'm proud to have been part of that, because I think it's really going to make a difference. And I think we're going to see that roll out over time, and that's how you get someone and you put them on a path to success. I think that's worth talking about. My colleague Ken had also talked about art spaces, and absolutely right. That's another service that happens in our community that brings people together and deals with isolation. I was happy to get some new potential art spaces secured in some developments. And of course, folks that know that I support the Etobicoke Hub initiative because I understand that these services are dispersed, trying to get them in one place and address mobility within this part of the city to get to those services so people have a decent life is really important.
Sorry, thank you, Stephen. And lastly, Thomas, on this question.
The National Day for Truth and Reconciliation was just a couple of weeks ago, and I tried to find a local Indigenous community center here in Etobicoke where I could go and be a responsible settler and educate myself on these issues, but I couldn't find one because there isn't one. I ended up having to leave Etobicoke to spend some time with the Every Child Matters over in York South-Weston. I'm also not aware of a single community center here in Etobicoke focused on serving the needs of the Black community either. There's a significant need for these to be created. There's a community center currently in development at Cloverdale Mall, but I don't think it will be equity focused. As the name suggests, there should be a community center at the center of every community. Community centers should be included in the 15-minute city plan and should be accessible to every resident, addressing the needs of the local area. Many of the large housing and condo developments in the city provide many of the same amenities that you would find in a community center privately for the residents on mid and upper floors of their towers, where they cost the developers a fortune to build, raise the rents for residents, and largely go underutilized. I will motion for the city to set a new standard for these developments. So instead of building build community centers on their ground floors, accessible to the public. This reduces the cost of building these amenities, raises revenue by adding more residential units on the floors that would have been occupied with them, thus lowering the rent, improving affordability, and also ensuring that the amenities are actually used by the community. This also presents a wonderful opportunity for local artists to collaborate on the design of these ground floor community centers and offer apprenticeship programs through our local art schools. This allows us to showcase the talent of Toronto's artists, creating unique, vibrant, and engaging structures that bring the community together. We can also cooperate with upper levels of government for extra funding by helping them meet their goals of diversity, inclusion, and truth and reconciliation. With a focus on equity, we can elevate BIPOC artists, building community centers as diverse and multicultural as the communities that they serve.
Thank you. Candidates, you're doing very well, and I appreciate your responses. We're moving on to our fourth question, and Stephen, you will have the first response. This is on affordable housing and homelessness. There are numerous factors, of course, that prevent people from finding affordable housing in our city and in our area in Etobicoke. Homelessness and homeless deaths are a disgrace in this large and economically well-off city. Affordable housing targets and some inclusionary zoning measures have been agreed upon, but housing advocates consistently say we've fallen short of adequate policies and funding. Rent increases exponentially, and landlords enjoy vacancy decontrol, which enables huge increases. Even definitions of affordable vary widely, as we all know, and governments squabble about whose problem this is to solve, while people continue to find it increasingly hard to afford to live in Toronto. If elected, what specific actions might you initiate, support, or advocate for in both city policy and in community-based partnerships in order to create an increase in more affordable housing options across a spectrum of potential choices, including rental and home ownership options? Stephen, you're first.
Thanks, Brian. So affordable is something that's kicked around casually, but the term means a couple of very deliberate things. In the common sense, it means something that I can afford to pay, coming out of school or entering the housing market. That's a complicated question, more than 2 minutes, but there are things that the city does or does not do that affects the housing market. And one thing that we should be doing is being very careful about how we welcome new landlords into the market. There are people with basements that can be rented out, and there are developers that do performance to figure out whether they're going to invest in a building or not. The second part of the equation is the affordable in the more formal sense, and that really means subsidized. I would put to you, though, that the city is not well positioned or structured to actually engage in these type of programs. One of the things we do well is that we monetize assets, whether it's land assets or buildings or things that we've got, and we create those as inducements for developers to go and create locked in, protected, subsidized units. My fear is, though, is that we don't execute this well because we don't have a long-term plan. Those units expire over time and that subsidy is gone, and that could leave the person in the lurch, or at least there's not a long-term plan for that unit. What this really means is that there needs to be collaboration with the other orders of government that have access to income and have those political discussions about income redistribution with the correct orders of government that are well set to do that. We're executioners I mean that in a nice sense. We execute in the city. But those major policy decisions have to be made at the federal and provincial levels because they are a tool to actually move the funds on a sustainable front to have housing solutions for people that need it. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And Thomas, you are next.
Helsinki, the capital of Finland, solved homelessness. Turns out all you have to do is give them homes. Toronto spends $159 million a year on shelters. We should be spending that money on providing subsidized rent, building supportive homes, giving these people enough stability that they can get their lives together and get out of the system permanently. Our population is growing, and we have a severe shortage of affordable housing due to previous and current elected officials, one who's here today, not doing their jobs. But I don't think many people understand just how bad the situation really is. I've had several conversations during this campaign with young people, skilled people, university educated engineers who tell me that they can't see a future for themselves in Toronto. They want to buy houses and raise families, but the cost of housing here has completely outpaced any hope of ever saving up enough money for a down payment. So these talented young professionals are leaving to go live in Alberta, Halifax, Texas, Florida, anywhere where they can actually afford to pay for the life that they want. This will cause a brain drain of Toronto's human capital if we don't act quickly. Now let's go back in time to 2015, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. They noticed that the affordable housing supply was starting to shrink, so the city council passed a motion to create a dedicated task force to research and advise council on how to sustain it. Today, Pittsburgh is the most affordable city in North America. Lucky for us, there's a volunteer organization here called More Neighbors Toronto who have done all this work for us for free. They offered their recommendations to address the housing crisis. Their comprehensive platform is summarized in 5 steps. Legalize housing for all, make rules that make sense, build affordable at every opportunity, ensure consultations reflect communities, tax equitably and sustainably. I agree with their plan and I will support it. But I will also follow the example of Pittsburgh and motion for the creation of an affordable housing task force to advise City Council to ensure that our city remains affordable for generations to come.
Thank you, Thomas. And over to you then, Miriam, for the last response on this question.
Thank you. Renters are faced with short supply and no real protection against predatory practices. We see fraudulent evictions, we see raised rental rates in between tenants, we see people who don't know what rights they have, and a landlord and tenant board that's seriously backed up. Longtime homeowners worry if their kids can afford to buy homes in the city they grew up in. First-time home buyers watch anxiously as interest rates rise and inflation continues to go up. I think we need to be reminded that housing is a human right first, not an investment. I think the city needs to take action against speculators and investors who artificially inflate the values of our homes. Then there's the problem of rent evictions, where landlords are illegally kicking their tenants out for a coat of paint or some other excuse when that's not the way it's supposed to work. They do it just so they can increase the rent to whatever they want, because rent control guidelines are a contract between you and your current tenant. If you kick them out, you can charge them whatever, you can charge the new guy whatever you want. And the thing about evictions, like I said, is that a lot of people don't know what rights they have. A lot of times these landlords just download a form online and hand it to their tenant, and these tenants think there's a due process. I think that a lot of times they leave without a fuss, and I think it's because they don't know that there's a system in place that protects them, and with the landlord and tenant board backed up, I think that's true to a certain degree. I think for first-time home buyers, we should create tax-free first home savings accounts. We should ban bidding wars and house flipping within a year. I think we should take more action against Airbnbs and short-term rentals. I think we should charge them with municipal taxes, also as a revenue source for the city. I think that people should have rent-to-own pathways, in particular with some of the city's housing initiatives, such as the Toronto Community Housing. I think we should give people a chance to actually live in the city that they grew up in. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm hearing a lot of good ideas on a lot of these issues, and I really appreciate all of your responses. I want to include or encourage again our listeners, our audience, to add to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and just look through the questions that are there already and upvote any that you think are important to ask. We have 2 more prepared questions on the economy, revenues and infrastructure, and promoting a green economy. And once we're through those, we'll be asking questions from the audience. So do contribute to this conversation this evening by filling out a question of importance to you in the Q&A. But I want to turn now to Thomas. You will be the first to respond on this question of revenues and infrastructure. As the largest city in Canada, Toronto's population is expanding at a high rate, leaving us with a huge budget for infrastructure and making great demands on our lagging public services. To make matters worse, there are often competing interests among various levels of municipal, provincial, and federal governments, leaving the citizens of Toronto inadequately served while politicians and governments play the blame game. Property taxes and user fees are important tools at the city's disposal to increase revenues, but perhaps others need to be explored. So if elected, what specific revenue generation tools would you support or advocate for in order to build the necessary infrastructure, such as transit or the housing that we were just talking about, and provide the quality public services that are needed to accommodate the anticipated population growth we will continue to experience as the largest city in Canada? Thomas, over to you first.
Currently, the only way to generate more revenue is either raising property taxes or raising population density. Since we already discussed the housing crisis, we already know that the population will be increasing and densifying, which will provide more revenue to fund better services. But we don't necessarily have to stop there. There are 2 particular additional taxes that I would like to talk about because they both also help address the housing affordability crisis. A land value tax simply taxes the value of land, just like it says in the name. This is currently being used by Denmark, Hong Kong, and Singapore. Regardless of whether the land is vacant, a single-family home, or a high-rise, the owner is taxed solely on the land value. This works as an incentive to use the land the most effective way to offset that cost, leading to more density. This also simplifies the assessment process, providing some much-needed relief to the city staff, reducing the cost of property assessment, and more efficient spending of your tax dollars. A vacancy tax was approved last year by the City Council. By the way, Stephen Holiday was the only councillor to vote against it. This tax aims to ensure that housing that does get built will not be used as a commodity by an investor to park cash instead of providing a much-needed home to a person or family. Vacancy taxes are currently being used in Oakland, California, and Washington, D.C. There's over 9,000 vacant homes in Toronto, including a $12 million condo, which was featured on the news, that has never been lived in, sat empty for over 10 years, and is now listed for sale. Imagine how much revenue that could have generated. However, the proposed vacancy tax is far too low at just 1%. It needs to be much higher, considering housing prices have increased more than 7% annually. Investors will still make money leaving properties vacant, though this makes slightly less. Since sitting on empty property is hurting the city, we need to tax sufficiently to disincentivize people from doing it and make the owner pay the cost of vacancy. So I propose raising the tax to match any increase in the value of the property plus 1%. This removes any incentive to invest in vacant real estate.
Thank you, Thomas. And over to you, Miriam, for this question on revenues and infrastructure.
Well, I think we should first of all outline the fact that as it is, the city of Toronto is operating at an $850 million deficit. And to take that number and turn it into a real life situation, it's significant because what it means is that Toronto is barred from operating with a deficit budget. What does that mean for us? It means that in order to bring that budget to balance, the city has to make cuts to public services that are already stretched thin. What we need, I think, first of all, is more vigorous financial management. The city is extremely inefficient, and what it needs is to go through something of an audit to make sure money is being spent in the most efficient way possible. A particular example of that would be the city failing to do that is the hotels that overcharged the city $12 million just about for shelter systems. And this happened because there wasn't enough oversight to make sure funds were being used appropriately. On a larger scale, we see governments doing this all the time. An example of that would be the ArriveCan app that the government paid disputedly between 29 to 60 million. And it took developers in Toronto about a weekend to pull off on their own, and just $1 million. Right away, those developers said, hey, you know what? You need to open up these conversations. People are willing to help you out. People are willing to tell you that it's not that hard to do this. But the thing is, with all these backdoor closed meetings, people, not only does the government end up not fully understanding the situation, but their options are also limited. I think that the city should also aim to improve and make transit more attractive so that ridership continues to climb and advertisers stop pulling out, because if you go into the subway system now, you'll see that most of them are quite empty. There's not that much advertising. I also think things like the Toronto Outdoor Art Fair and Nuit Blanche shows us that when we throw events, people show up. I think we should partner more with our artistic and cultural communities. Go to art schools, throw art shows on city property and charge an admission fee. These are the things we can do to increase funds in creative ways for the city.
Thank you, Miriam. I appreciate that. And lastly, Stephen, on this question.
Thank you, Brian. I loathe the term revenue tools. In fact, I find it disingenuous. It's just a sugar-coated way of saying raising taxes. And some of the candidates have been very plain about that, right? That they support those sorts of things. I just don't understand how you can say that you care about affordability in the city and then turn around and just want to just raise taxes and make it more expensive to live. Not everybody can easily pay them. There are many, many people that are in stranded capital assets, and that means that maybe they bought a property and they've had it for many years, but they're struggling to make ends meet. And it's so difficult to hear people say, well, just take more out of them. Just take more and more and more. I'm what you call a tax purist. I like to focus all of the taxes right through the one tool that's the property tax bill. And if citizens are mad at me about that bill and I'm up for re-election, then I'm held accountable for that. And I'm accountable on how I spend that money, not by hiding it in different places like a municipal land transfer tax that only kind of stings you when you enter the market and stings you on the way out, which is unfair. Or dodging it into other places like tolls and fees and that sort of stuff. Just charge it up front. And then it becomes a question about priorities. And so absolutely, do we not put enough money into maintaining our assets and maintaining the services that we need? I'd love to have higher services and more, but City Council makes a series of decisions, and part of them are on massive social services like shelters that one of the other candidates mentioned. Why doesn't the federal government introduce some money to help with the shelters cost? Or yet give us more money, since it's some of their policies that drive some of these issues and drive the people into the shelter system. We take on more than our share of just our local citizens in Toronto, and it's very hard to keep going back to the property tax system to pay for all of that. It's a structure that doesn't work.
Thank you, Stephen. And we're going on to our last question now. And that question is on promoting a green economy and small business development. Toronto could, and sorry, Miriam, you will be the first to respond to this question. Toronto could, with appropriate political will, become a true leader in the development of a 360-degree green economy. There are various opportunities in emergency industries and businesses, as well as entrepreneurships, and a need to become more vigorous in supporting the training and employment compensation of green economy workers. While the pandemic has been a huge economic challenge for everyone, including the city, The time has come to move beyond it and make the necessary economic shifts to facilitate a green economy that will help mitigate the climate crisis. If elected, then, what specific measures would you support or advocate for in order to create good green economy jobs, supply adequate training for those jobs and compensation for those workers, and support small businesses in the development of such jobs? Marion, you're first with 2 minutes to respond.
Thank you. Well, in order to make the necessary shifts to facilitate that green economy, to help, mitigate the crisis and become a leader in the green economy, I think we need to get the right people here. I think we need to remove barriers and open up the talent pool. And to do that, we need to start by making housing affordable to keep people here, because what we're experiencing is a mass exodus of talent and young people who can no longer afford to stay here. I think we also need to make housing affordable to attract new people to come, because, as I've said, the more people there are, the better chance we have at actually accomplishing our lofty goals. I think following the pandemic, another thing for businesses across the city is the labor crisis that has left a lot of retailers and restaurants struggling to find employees. And I think that in a green economy, it would be the same thing. A lot of times, these businesses, when they were surveyed, they said that the number one problem they face is workforce access. And what this means is that in an environment where it's already impossible to attract and keep talent, the ability for people to get to and from work couldn't be more important than now. I think, and while progress is being made in the form of new subways and buses and bike lanes and other transit expansion plans, I think we need a more unified transit system that's not only more faster, but more affordable. I know that the city right now has a number of transit affordability programs that subsidize the cost of riding the TTC, but I think we need to go beyond what we have right now. And I think we need to, I think we need to work with other governments within our system at both the provincial and federal level to negotiate a deal that allows for a more harmonious transit system with the GO train and other local municipal train systems as well. So I know that that's not something we can do just at a municipal level, but I think that we need to start putting more pressure on the other governments to help accomplishing this bigger goal, because it's not just for us, it's for the whole country. Thank you.
Miriam, thank you. And Stephen, you are next on this question.
There we go, the unmute. Thanks, Brian. It's actually a very forward and exciting type of question. We have a great tech sector in the city of Toronto, and you can see our government working to further induce that, to attract companies here. I think green goes with tech. It fits hand in hand. It's about our future. Example would be, companies like Uber and Lyft, who are tech companies that connect rideshare. And you think how that's transformed. I can think of a family member that gave up his car because he can rely on those newer technologies to move around the city, and it's changing us. I think of Ecobee, a great company that does digital home automation with respect to heating and automating that and optimizing that. But remember this thing I held up earlier in the meeting? It was a thing that was sent around by the city of Toronto, and it says, change your furnace away from gas to something else and upgrade your windows and doors and properly insulate your home. What do you think is going to do that? Have you tried getting any of this done right now? It's hard to get a worker right now. It's hard to get a price that's even affordable. We have a huge gap. I'm not sure that the city is the only person that can fill that, but there's certainly partnerships that can be done to make that exciting. I know, again, but with my work with Toronto Hydro, there's work that they do with colleges and universities to bring people in from the trades and into the electricity sector because they need people. And it's exciting work and it's rewarding work. I also think of one other vector, which is community benefits agreements. When there's major civil projects going on, there are deliberate agreements made to bring people into the employment world and to train them for the future. And a lot of that includes construction, technology, and green tech. So I actually think the future is bright on this, and I think there's a lot of things that are happening. And boy, what a great topic. I wish I could talk about it some more, but thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And Thomas, you have the last word on this last prepared question.
We've talked a lot about housing, transit, infrastructure, all of which needs to be built sustainably, but we don't actually have enough workers with the right training to do it, and many are ready to retire. Laborers are getting understandably frustrated that they're building all these unaffordable homes they could never even dream of living in. On top of providing more affordable housing for our working class, we urgently need to cooperate with our local trade schools and the province to expand the apprenticeship program and get these jobs filled with trained workers. I want the city to provide a single access point into this program through the city website to streamline the process and make it as efficient as possible. But let's not pretend that we can achieve our climate action goals by putting green jobs in a little green box in the corner of our economy. Every job is a green job. I will move for the city website to provide a toolkit for everyone in every job in every sector to advocate to their employer on behalf of the city as a climate ambassador to do their part to achieve our collective climate goals. Toronto is the biggest city in Canada, the most multicultural city in the world, and it should be a melting pot of ideas, fostering innovation and sustainable technologies. We desperately need to empower our entrepreneurs and innovators by providing support in the form of workspaces, networking connections, and even grants and investments through cooperation with upper levels of government. We have good projects like the N-Wave project I mentioned earlier and several carbon neutral community developments in the area, and we can't afford to hamstring ourselves by not supporting the workers who will actually build it. And we learned some really important lessons during the pandemic when it comes to small businesses. Open Streets TO, Cafe TO, Active TO, all benefited small businesses tremendously. By creating safe, dense, mixed-use 15-minute communities that can be navigated easily by walking, cycling, or taking transit, small businesses thrive.
Thank you. That ends our prepared answers. And it's always interesting what kinds of questions we get from our audience members. And we've taken a few and sifted through them a bit, and I'm going to ask you a question about long-term care homes, actually, in our ward. And so here's a question that comes from our audience. What would you do and or support to ensure that Etobicoke Centre long-term care homes are providing good quality of care to residents and not focusing as much on profit? And you have 2 minutes to respond. And our first respondent is Stephen.
Thanks, Brian. Well, I mean, I can point with pride to Westburn Manor. It's right across from the Etobicoke Civic Center. That is the City-One long-term care home, a very popular place, and in my opinion, a very well-run place. And you can tell because the waiting list to get in is long. I do know we debate these things at City Council. We have talked about different care models. But there is continued investment in that. And I think an approach to service excellence in our long-term care homes. I get to go to the awards events for those and just see how people give back even within the home with a sense of pride. And I use that word home because that's what it is when you walk in. You almost feel like you want to take your shoes off because you're coming into someone's place rather than an institution. We do have some other retirement residences. I'm not sure all of them or any of them meet the bar of long-term care home, but they are long-term care like. And those are things that are highly regulated by the province. But anytime something that is seniors focused comes along, and I can give an example just up on Royal York Road, there was a new development. It is something that is well welcomed and facilitated through the planning process. And even that one example wasn't without local controversy from resistance from residents in the area, but you know, that's a project a lot of us can turn to and say, you can debate the size and the shape of it, but bringing more facilities like this into this part of the city to respond to the needs of the people that live here and allow people to age within their own community and stay here are really important. So I'm glad the question came up because it's an important topic for people in Etobicoke Centre.
Yes, I believe you and others would be aware that we have the highest percentage of seniors, I think, in Etobicoke, if not Etobicoke Centre itself. And So this is an important topic. Thomas, you're next on this question of long-term care homes.
Well, during the pandemic, we learned that profit-driven long-term care homes universally had worse outcomes across the board. So we know that that motive needs to be completely taken out of our healthcare system. So I would move for all municipal long-term care homes to be nonprofit going forward, and do everything I can to make sure we get all of the ones that are for profit into the nonprofit sector. I will work with provincial government to expand aging in place programs, providing additional supportive nursing and everything that our elders need to stay in their homes as long as possible. By building these 15-minute communities I've been talking about, we need to make them more accessible to people with limited mobility, make sure that every community has sidewalks and bicycle lanes. We need to keep our elders in their communities that they've lived in their whole lives with their supportive networks and near their families. And we stand to lose a lot of knowledge if we keep putting all of these elders in these long-term care facilities, locking them up like prisoners. It's not right, and we should be doing a lot better.
Thank you very much. And lastly, Miriam on this question.
Thank you. I think when we think of profitization, we think of corporations taking advantage of consumers. The whole point of it is that these companies are invented to make the most profit possible for their owners, and that's exactly what they're doing. I think they do as little as possible for the people themselves, and what does that say for their mental health? I think that's one of the biggest issues in long-term care homes, and I think that we need to get creative with our solutions to make sure that everyone has a good quality of life. I think we can do things like get kids who need volunteer hours to come in and spend time with them. It seems like an obvious answer, but when I was in high school, there wasn't really, if you seek it yourself, it's there, but I think we need to go beyond that. I think we need to go into these schools and let them know that this is an option. I also think that we could create more art programs, more cultural programs, so that they actually get to spend their time in a meaningful way. I think for a person, it's really important to wake up and have a sense of purpose. I think it's important to make sure that they know that they matter. And I think that we're not doing enough in those regards. I think we think of it most often as a provincial problem, but I think there are little ways in our municipality that we can do to make things better for them as well. I think something else we can do, as the other candidates noted, was kind of make the area around it more accessible for them as well. And I think in general, I think we should always veer away from privatization, because when you go that route, people tend to put profit over people, and I don't think that's how we should treat our elderly.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
and thank you to the questioner for that issue. Our second question from the audience, which Thomas will respond to first, is the current provincial government has made several changes to environment and land use planning policies. How do you think Toronto should respond to accommodate changes to the Conservation Authority Act and reduced review time for planning applications? And finally, would you support inclusionary zoning across Toronto? Thomas first.
Well, I'll address the second question first. Yes, I support inclusionary zoning across Toronto. I also support ending exclusionary zoning across Toronto. We need to get housing built everywhere, and we need it fast. We need to empower the private sector to do it on their own, as well as provide all the funding necessary and resources necessary to get the public sector providing public housing as well. We need a broad spectrum approach. Now, because of the lack of movement in housing for the last several decades, the province has come in with a heavy-handed fist to try and correct the problem by forcing through all of these developments. If we had been more welcoming as a community for new developments, this wouldn't have happened. I think our best approach right now is to show the province that we are willing to develop, start getting it done, cooperate with them, make sure that we are in control of what is going where, but not if.
Thank you. And Miriam, you are next on this question of environment and land use planning policies, reduced review time for planning applications, and inclusionary zoning.
Thank you. Well, I think generally with bylaws, the problem with bylaws and red tape is that usually it seems to be an outdated source of thinking that as soon as pen is put to paper and a policy is established, there's no going back. The reality is we live in an ever-changing landscape, and revisions not only should be made, they must be made to keep up with the times. But I think it's not always an end-all be-all. I think that at the end of the day, we need to listen to the communities. As I mentioned earlier, with the disruption of migration of local species and their habitat, sometimes it's not the best approach to rush things. I think that we need to open up the dialogue. We need to bring more people in. We need to have more bodies in place that are making sure that all the right groups are being supported. I think sometimes, especially when it comes to Etobicoke Centre, certain developments just don't suit the area. I think that we should stop making decisions that won't necessarily have all the information on. And so I think, you know, when it comes to things like heritage sites and you know, red tape in that regard, we should take a second look. But I think that when it comes to making sure that the right protocol is being put in place and environment is being protected, we really should take our time and make sure that the right things are being done, because once these decisions are made, it's really difficult to take it back.
Thank you, Miriam. And Stephen, you have the last response on this question.
Thank you. So, you know, there's a point to be made about the amount of time it takes to get a development approval. And we know this more acutely right now because of the rising cost of inflation, the rising cost of materials, and the rising cost of labor. This affects the developer's performa. They know this. This means it's risks, and those risks get baked back into the cost of housing. That said, you know, I'm not here to serve the interests of developers. I'm here to serve the community overall. And I've actually been quite critical of many of the changes because of this narrative that's being put out by politicians of all stripe at all levels, that suddenly we have to, and I'll say it respectfully to my colleague there about cutting red tape, because the red tape that they seem to have circled is the community consultation or the community's right of appeal, or the steps that you actually have to take to bring a development application so that every stakeholder has a chance to own part of that decision. And that, I think, is going to erode people's confidence in government. And I was very critical of things that City Council was doing during the pandemic, ramming through different things through ministers' zoning orders, when, you know, in my words, you know, they thought people weren't looking because they were preoccupied with something else. Controversial decisions that ended up circling back around. So if it's cutting that red tape, cutting people's rights of appeal, where people say in it, I don't agree. And the last thing is I would say out of caution, because I don't have a lot of time here on inclusionary zoning. I've spoken a lot about it, but everyone points to it as a panacea, but there is no free lunch. The developers have to pay for the benefits that they include in the inclusionary zoning one way or another, whether it's, you know, cutting back on the built form or passing costs off in another way. Society and the area around it ultimately pays for it. So, you know, it's a zero-sum equation. It always adds up, but you have to look for these little details. And, you know, I'd love to have a deeper conversation about it, but it's not a magic solution.
Thank you. No, yes, we've been getting a number of questions, and I have a rather lengthy last question for you from the audience. And I'll just read it, and I might read it again for our second respondent. Our first respondent will be Miriam. And the question is this: the city's Vision Zero initiative has included speed limit reductions in dozens of corridors throughout the city. Unfortunately, in many areas of the city, this much needed initiative is supplanted by the city's own road classification system, where many roads classified as major arterial actually have significant portions of their length running substantially or completely through residential areas and school zones, thus preventing any permanent speed limit reductions in these areas. What is your position of allowing permanent modifications, for example, school zones with reduced speed limits and/or automated speed enforcement devices to sections of these MA roads in order to better control traffic and speeds, thus increasing the likelihood of achieving the city's vision of 0 deaths or injuries involving road traffic, while at the same time not impacting the city's road classification system in any way? A long question, but it's basically about speed and controlling traffic. Miriam first.
I think that's an important one, and I think that's one of the major issues in this election. I think that in particular, Etobicoke Centre sees a lot of speeding and people who are being completely irresponsible when it comes to the roads. You know, it went from the type of neighborhood that was a little sleepy to now being, you know, a major arterial road. I think that when it comes to automated speed enforcement, I think there are a couple of restrictions that sometimes make it difficult. Right now, the city's policy is that in order to put one of those machines in, it has to be within a school zone. It has to be plugged within a major traffic intersection. And then on top of that, it can't be around any sharp curves. I know that the Bermanthorpe Road is a particular place where people see a lot of speeding. And the reality is a lot of times the tickets don't work. There are a lot of like surveys and newspaper articles that I read that talked about how record number of tickets are being given out. You know, on Mills Road in particular, there's radar data from April that shows it made up 5,545. It gave out that many tickets, and 2,626 of them were repeat offenders. I think that when you want to improve the roads, you really have to look at these couple of things. You have to look at mechanical engineering, and you have to look at traditional police enforcement. Now, I know that the police enforcement, they say that they're stretched in. They can't always bring someone in, but that's why we should increase our talent pool, bring in some engineers that put in, you know, rumble strips, put in those little islands that force people to kind of slow down. I think we need to go beyond what's typically expected, and I think we need to really look at some new ways to tackle these issues.
Sorry, thank you, Miriam. And Stephen, you are next on this question.
Thanks, Brian. I actually spent 40 minutes with a reporter on this today, so I'm going to do it in 2. Obviously, a very popular topic for a councillor's office. A lot in that question, but major arterial speed reductions have been done in Etobicoke Centre. I was part of that, and I voted for those. But they're done in a very meaningful way. You can't just change a tin sign and expect cars to behave differently. And in fact, if you do it wantonly, they'll just ignore it. And then you actually end up with a more dangerous situation because you get somebody driving the absolute speed limit and somebody tearing through there because they just don't respect it. And it's actually an engineering principle. So the speeds are actually tailored around the road, and there is a downward pressure on them. All this is to say is that Vision Zero is a data-driven initiative. There's maps and maps and maps of data on this, and it's very targeted in what it's trying to achieve to do, which is to reduce killed and seriously injured. And all of that means is there's a methodical approach. I am extremely disciplined when it comes to mixing in politics and the science of road engineering, and I look to qualified experts to tell us where these interventions need to be done based on the data, and you follow the advice of the people that understand how the roads work. A little more political is the automated speed enforcement, and that was brought in. There's 1,000 schools in the city. So we've only just rotated through the first echelon, but the point of that was to protect the most vulnerable, which are school kids, and to get people to calm down. And I disagree with Miriam on it. Go over to Renforth Drive. You know, there's a memory, and that was one of the first places where the automated speed enforcement was installed, and it did get drivers to slow down. I know it. I've seen it. I've measured it. And there's a memory effect. So, you know, I actually support more of these cameras being around, but at this stage, I still want to keep rotating them through the 1,000 schools in the city because they're at the top of the pyramid of the most vulnerable road users. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen. And lastly, Thomas on this question.
First, I'd like to point out that Stephen voted against the Vision Zero budget. And like I said in my intro, I work on road safety every day. It's part of my work with autonomous vehicles is making sure that they are identifying pedestrians and cyclists appropriately. I'm endorsed by Toronto Community Bikeways Coalition. I attended the road safety rally and I gave a speech there. And part of my 15-minute community's vision includes turning major arteries into complete streets with sidewalks, dedicated bus lanes, and dedicated bicycle lanes, and beautifying our streetscape with trees and gardens, encouraging more drivers to get out of their cars, walk, bicycle, and use transit, participate in their community instead of commuting by car. And our residential streets should have traffic calming designs, forcing drivers to slow down, forcing them to weave through, what are they called, chicanes. And I also support using automated traffic cameras and are identified particularly bad areas where there are repeating offenses. I do not support using Toronto Police Service to enforce speed limits like this when we can use automated traffic cameras for less money. Sorry, was there more to this question? Okay, I'll just stop there.
It was a long question, Thomas. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Would you highlight school zones in particular for reducing speeds? I think you addressed.
Yes, I support a speed limit of 40 kilometers per hour on major roads and 30 kilometers per hour on residential roads, and enforcing all school zones for reduced speed limits as well.
Thank you. And listen, I'm going to give Stephen the opportunity to rebut what you said because I saw him shaking his head. And this is not meant to be a negative comment, but Stephen, do you want to clarify what may have been said?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Look, I try to respect free speech and people's comments, but to be fair, there's been many votes on Vision Zero and many pieces. And I do recall an instance, and perhaps that's what the candidate is referring to, where there were some motions on the floor to try to increase the budget. The problem was they didn't really come with a plan. And the proper way to budget major city initiatives is to go through the budget process on an annual basis. I think you would find that across the board, councillors are very supportive of the Vision Zero initiative, and they have to balance that against all the competing city priorities. So I raised an eyebrow because I'm not sure that was entirely fair. I can point to lots of examples of plenty of support that I've given to Vision Zero, and you know, I understand it's political debate, so thank you for letting me say that.
My screen froze there for a second, so I thought I might have lost you, but thank you for that. We're going to go to last comments now, a closing statement of 2 minutes each, and then I will very, very briefly close this evening. But let's turn to you, Stephen, again for your last comment on any issues that we haven't raised or what you would like to say to the voters.
No, just really thank you for the opportunity to come before you and talk a little bit about my approach to things. And you know, a respect for the competitor candidates here. And in fact, you know, obviously we approach things philosophically differently on a political basis, but I actually saw a lot of common ground in the issues. And that's one thing I've noticed at council, especially when it comes to human-oriented services and when it comes to things like the environment. We have different approaches, but we're trying to reach the same common goal. And to the voters that are making a choice, you know, I do bring an 8-year track record and lots of personal experience to this job, a lot of pizzazz and a lot of love for it. And I think I have a lot to offer, both in terms of experience and accomplishments. And absolutely a record that shows that it's treated with the respect that it deserves on a very personal basis. So I hope you cast your votes wisely. Please know that I'm available if you've got any questions. My contact information and my website is www.holiday.ca. But you know, please send them along. And if you want to engage on any of the topics tonight, They are very lengthy discussions and very exciting ones, and I'm happy to have that conversation with anyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, and thanks for participating tonight. And Thomas, over to you.
Thank you,
closing
Etobicoke
remarks.
Climate Action, AccuLinks Etobicoke, and Central Etobicoke Community Hub Initiative for hosting. Thank you to everyone in the audience for the opportunity to speak to you. We can't afford to keep re-electing the same career politicians who are robbing us of our tax dollars and not delivering results. A city councillor is supposed to represent everyone. Does the son of a former mayor represent you? He definitely doesn't represent me. I'm a renter who works 2 jobs and uses public transit. I want to imagine a future for myself in the city, but unless things change, there is no hope for my generation or those that follow us. The future I want for Toronto is 15-minute communities that are safe, accessible, sustainable, equitable, and resilient. The way to achieve that is through zoning reform, more variety of housing, better road design, electrification of heating and public transit, bicycle lanes, bus lanes, more native trees, gardens and parks. All the things we talked about today are detailed in my platform on my website, which I'll put in the chat for you. And you can also follow me on social media or email me any questions you have directly. I've been working hard to reach everybody I can in this campaign, but Etobicoke Centre is a huge ward with more than 94,000 registered voters, and I'm sorry if I haven't gotten to your door. I've been featured in local newsletters and newspapers, on TV, doing interviews, answering questionnaires from local advocacy groups, signing pledges, receiving endorsements, and answering your questions that you've sent me by email. I've been completely accessible and transparent, and that will not change when I'm elected. Etobicoke Centre needs a new councillor who doesn't vote no on everything. Stephen Holiday does not represent you. If you disagree with my platform, vote for Catherine Havis. If you want a councillor who will actually represent everyone in Etobicoke Centre, vote for me, Thomas Iannaciello. We can work together to build the world-class Toronto we all know it can be.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you for participating tonight. We all appreciate it. And Miriam, the last word is to you for your closing remarks.
When I ask myself what makes a great leader, it's not just so much who they are that makes them great, but about their why that sets them apart. I think the real purpose of leadership has been lost on us. Leadership isn't about job title or position in life or a set list of characteristics that make someone the right fit for the job. Real leadership isn't about who you are, but about what you represent and why you're driven to push forward in the face of adversity. Whether we'd like to admit it or not, our politics have hit a rut. We expect our politics to look a certain way, and we're all familiar with the mudslinging and large amounts of money that come with the territory. Apathy plagues our elections, and who can blame us when we've been proven time and time again that a politician's promise is often just a stringing together of words. Ever since I was younger, I've always felt things a little deeper than most. Can't exactly explain it, but when I see something that's wrong, I just can't let it go. Part of that comes from knowing what it's like to be the underdog. When you've been through hardship and know what it's like to be the little guy or the odd one out, you learn to navigate the world a little differently. You look a little closer, you speak a little softer, and you fight harder for people that are like you. I think everyone's opinions matters. Everyone's voice matters. Our struggle may come in different packages, but we all endure them the same. I'm applying to this position because I'm passionate about social issues, and my record shows that. The other candidates might talk a big game, but what have they ever done in their personal lives outside this election to help people? I was born into many of the issues that plague this city. My mother lives in Toronto community housing. My dad's a senior citizen on a fixed guaranteed income. These issues are bigger than winning an election for me. These issues directly affect me and the people I care about. I'm used to being shut out of the conversation. I'm used to people forgetting my name. I have a bone to pick with Thomas because this is the second time that he's, wished Catherine Havis good luck and he has refused to acknowledge me. I think it's enough that I get women and women of color get pushed out of the conversation. I think it's unfair, and I think we need to open up the conversation to everyone.
Thank you very much. Listen, Thomas, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Miriam. I'm not trying to ignore you. I think you're a very qualified candidate. I think you'll do very well in politics, just not in this election. You haven't put in the work for this election, but definitely make a name for yourself, and you do have a future. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to omit you.
This was never meant to be a debate or to be a time to make digs at each other, but we are trying to conclude our evening, and I will thank our viewers tonight because it was a great experience for your sponsoring organizations, of which I represent all three. And this concludes the evening tonight. As you can see on the screen, we are putting up a poll for any of you who want to stay, which we will keep on the screen for a bit hereafter we close. And my last word is to say that we hope that you might really exercise your franchise, because it is important to vote. There's a tendency in the Canadian society in all three levels of government and elections to have a reduced number of people who are voting. And if you don't vote, it's really hard to be critical of our leaders. So exercise your franchise, get out there to vote, either in the advance polls or in the on election day on October 24th. And thank you very much for taking part tonight, and thank you to our candidates. All the best.